Good evening, everyone. My name is Israel, and I'm from the city of Guanajuato. I've had several disturbing paranormal experiences that I'd like to share with you one by one, but today I want to specifically share my experience working in an old house that currently functions as a small 3-star hotel, where I was the night shift receptionist from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Since I was the only employee on that shift, because not much staff was needed at that hour, I also became the night watchman, maintenance man, and bellboy. In those more than 2 years that I worked there, many strange and unexplained things happened. I want to tell you about the ones I consider the most relevant and striking. Maybe many of you won't believe me, and that's understandable because even many friends and family said it was just my imagination. But when I had the opportunity to take them to the hotel, or they came to visit me, they experienced it firsthand. That's when their perspective changed. I started working there because the owner of the hotel, who was also a friend of my brother, contacted me knowing that I had just left my previous job and had been unemployed for a week. Since I had previously been a receptionist, I didn't hesitate to take the position. I didn't like the idea of working at night or early morning because I consider my sleep and rest sacred, but the need was great and weighed more. I think we've all been in that situation. That hotel was a very large house with 5 levels and had a terrace with a view of the city. It was located in the heart of the historic center and bordered a church. It had a facade with the distinctive style of the central houses, and although from the outside it didn't appear so, it housed around 23 rooms of different sizes, from individual rooms to a couple of suites with capacity for up to 10 people, besides common areas and a small restaurant. The first weeks of work were somewhat tough because it was hard for me to get used to the new schedule. Although I must confess that this shift allowed me to sleep intermittently almost every day since I worked only from Sunday to Thursday, and normally the occupancy of rooms on those days is very low compared to Fridays and Saturdays, which are the peak days for any hotel. My workday basically consisted of working continuously from my arrival at 8 p.m. until 1 or 2 a.m. when I turned off all the lights. Then I slept until 7 a.m., woke up to do the cash register balance, and got ready to hand over to the next receptionist on shift. The only thing that interrupted my sleep during that rest period between 2 and 7 was the arrival of the laundry service at 5 a.m., and occasionally some guests who decided to arrive or leave the hotel at late hours of the night. Despite being a tedious and exhausting routine, I enjoyed doing my job a lot, although today I can't imagine doing it again. The truth is, working from Sunday to Thursday in a hotel, as I mentioned earlier, was usually quiet due to the low demand for rooms during the week. There were days when I had at most, and exaggerating, 8 occupied rooms, but normally only 2 rooms were occupied, 1, or sometimes none. So there were times when I was completely alone, which I enjoyed a lot because it meant I could rest without so many interruptions and without having to deal with ill-tempered, rude, or arrogant clients who often came to the place. Although later I didn't enjoy being alone so much, and I'm going to tell you why. Not even a month had passed working in the hotel, and I was already starting to experience strange situations inside, which became recurring as the days went by. I remember very well that the first incidents had to do with doors that opened or closed by themselves, lights, televisions, or fans that turned on for no reason, footsteps heard in the corridors when there was no one, and murmurs on the staircase to the terrace when it was closed or when there wasn't even a guest. It's going to sound strange and many will think I'm trying to act brave, but all this that was happening I let pass easily and simply tried to ignore it because, as it turns out, in my mother's house, I had lived through similar experiences, even stronger and more terrifying, which, as I said at the beginning, I will surely tell you on another occasion. So, in some way, I was already accustomed, although it didn't stop surprising me or giving me a scare suddenly, because I always had to deal with this alone. And so I carried on my work life for almost a year. Almost every day, at least once a week, something strange happened that I couldn't explain. When I went up to turn off the corridor lights, the light of some room on an upper or lower level would turn on. In the kitchen, the refrigerator would open, or the cutlery would clink. Objects would fall from the restaurant bar, and while I tried to sleep, Sometimes I would get up because I heard footsteps in the corridor or knocks on the hotel door, which was closed for security after midnight. But on the cameras, you could see that there was no one knocking or walking through the corridor. I reported all this to my boss for him to review on the cameras, but they just ignored it and told me to continue with my work. It always seemed very strange to me. One day I met with my brother, and he asked me if strange things were still happening in the hotel as I had told him before. I told him yes, and he said the following. "It's just that last weekend I went out with Javier, my boss and owner of the hotel, and he asked about you, how I saw you or how you felt at work. I told him everything was fine, that I saw you happy and calm working with him. And that's when he told me that his last 4 receptionists hadn't lasted more than 2 months in the hotel because they couldn't handle all the activity there, that even some, after a week, simply stopped going and never showed up at the hotel again, not even to resign. He asked me not to tell you because he doesn't want to scare you. He's happy with your work. But he also doesn't want to have to look for receptionists again because it's been very hard for him to get them to stay." I was surprised by what he told me because what was happening there wasn't precisely something that would make you want to run away. So there were 2 options. Either the previous receptionists were very fearful, or I hadn't experienced something so strong until then. I also realized why he brushed me off when I reported all the noises and movements that had no explanation. Unfortunately, a few months after that conversation with my brother, the pandemic reached the country, and with it many measures and restrictions that affected all sectors, but especially tourism, since it was requested that people not travel to other cities unless extremely necessary. As you can imagine, the hotel stopped receiving guests as regularly as it did before the arrival of that virus. Despite the situation and the multiple staff cuts, my boss didn't fire me, and I continued working there, but that meant being alone and without company in the hotel more days than I was used to. For me, it was fine because they kept paying me despite spending my working hours doing practically nothing, and I was already used to not having guests from time to time. Those days I spent in solitude. I kept all the hotel lights off except for the reception area, where I always was, reviewing reservation updates and other functions. To reduce service costs, the hotel couldn't afford to leave lights on that weren't being used, both indoors and outdoors. So I spent the whole night illuminated only by the light of a bulb and the computer screen. Many nights the noises continued to be heard, and the lights and fans kept turning on by themselves. But I limited myself to turning everything off and returning to my place, and as always, I went to sleep after finishing my shift. I must confess that from then on, not having guests, I took advantage of sleeping in one of the individual rooms that was very close to the reception. Before the pandemic, I used to sleep on a cot in the restaurant area, which was uncomfortable and cold. I always left the door of that room open to be able to hear the phone, the doorbell, or the arrival of the laundry staff. In those months of confinement, it was extremely rare for someone to come to stay. At one point, I even went more than 2 weeks without receiving anyone until one night, around 12:30, a family arrived composed of 2 adults in their 40s with their 2 children, 8 and 10 years old respectively, who booked 3 nights in advance. Immediately after registering them, they went to sleep in a room that was at the end of the corridor on the 3rd floor. Since it was empty, I let them choose their room. After settling them in, I turned off all the lights as usual and went to the individual room that I had already assigned myself to rest more comfortably. I was sleeping peacefully until I started to hear that amidst cries and loud orders, several people were quickly coming down the stairs. I jumped up, turned on the reception light, and upon turning to the staircase, I saw that the family I had just registered a few hours ago was coming down in their pajamas, running with all their luggage. The man said to me brusquely and desperately the following: "We're leaving. We're going to go. We can't spend another second in that room." I asked him why he was leaving if everything was okay and offered to change their room. He only said these words: "I don't know what's happening here or what happened in that room, but there's something, and it won't let us be at peace. I don't care if you don't give me my money back. What I want is to get out of here." Then he just picked up his youngest son and left. I was so impacted by the reaction of the children and the parents that, When I peeked and saw that the light of the newly vacated room was still on and the door was open, I decided not to go up to the room. I decided to leave everything as it was until 7:30 in the morning, when natural light was coming through the windows. Then I went up to turn off the lights and close the door. I called my boss to tell him what had happened, and he just told me to read them the terms and conditions if they called to ask for a refund, but he said nothing more. Nothing about what I had just told him. Of course, we never heard from that family again, not even online reviews or comments on reservation pages. A couple of weeks later, something very similar happened with a young couple of about 23 years old, who were just looking for a decent place to be intimate, who checked in around 1 a.m. in a room next to the one where the family I told you about had stayed. These lovers, well, I can't confirm they were lovers, didn't run out, but they told me that someone was walking around laughing in the corridor in front of their room, and that the bathroom light turned on by itself a couple of times. It was too strange, but I had to pretend that nothing was happening to prevent the clients from getting scared. Also, on one occasion when I was receiving the laundryman, I helped him unload the clean clothes from his truck while he was putting others into the linen area we had inside the hotel. After leaving the things, he crossed paths with me on the stairs and made a comment that left me confused. "Hey man, what a scare your guest gave me." After dropping off the sheets, I happened to see her sitting in the dark there on the couch in the corridor, and well, I got scared. I just said hello and that's it. I don't know if you want to go see if she needs something. I pretended to be calm and didn't say anything to him. I knew perfectly well that there was no one staying in the hotel that night, but since I knew that the laundryman was very fearful, I didn't want to tell him anything else. Weeks went by, and although these noises and lights or televisions that turned on by themselves persisted, I hadn't had another event as strong as those with the guests or the laundryman. However, I never thought that I would experience one of the most impactful, most shocking experiences of my life there. Remembering it still sends a shiver down my spine, and there are no words that can be written or do justice to what I experienced, but I will try to explain clearly what happened. One Tuesday night, I arrived at the hotel as usual, began my tasks. There was no one scheduled to arrive that night or the rest of the week, so I expected another night alone. Night fell, and as always, I stayed with only one light on in reception, waiting for any instruction from my boss or in case any unexpected reservation arrived, but nothing happened. It was 2 a.m., and as always at that time, I turned off the computer screen, the music, and the light. I was left in complete darkness, and almost no light came in from outside, only what came through the windows from the adjacent church. I went for a blanket and walked in the dark towards the individual room where I was already used to sleeping. I opened the door, and before entering to lie down, I heard a noise that came from about the height of the 4th level, a noise that you barely heard if you paid close attention. It was like the intermittent sobbing of an adolescent or young woman. That threw me off a lot. First, because there was no one in the hotel but me, and second, because among all the noises I had heard, none had sounded like a sob before, or a cry, or a laugh, or any noise that could be human. It was the first time. I froze upon hearing the slight lament, and in the complete darkness that enveloped me, I tried to distinguish where it came from or what caused it. Of course, I couldn't see anything, but I am 100% sure that the origin of that noise came from the 4th floor before the stairs that led to the terrace. My mind wanted to force me to walk to the reception and turn on the light, but instinct froze me. Fear began to set in. Then I remained under the door frame, looking towards the corridor. If the light had been on, I could see from where I was the 4 levels of corridors in the hotel and could know who was sobbing. But the darkness didn't let me distinguish anything, despite having already gotten used to that gloom. The sob continued to be heard intermittently for about 15 more seconds. "Hello?" was the first thing that occurred to me to say, and of course no one answered me. I just heard the lament again. "Hello?" I said again, louder, but nothing changed. I could no longer remain so calm because the fear was increasing, but I made an effort to calm down. I didn't know what to do, whether to go to sleep, stay where I was, or go up to investigate. "Is someone there?" I asked aloud. "If someone is there, are you okay?" Unlike previous times, I received the worst of responses. A harrowing sound accompanied by a wail resounded throughout the hotel, like those cries, like those laments that some women have when they are burying a loved one in the cemetery. The disturbing scream made me shout out an expletive, and the only thing I could think of was to get inside and lock the door of the room with the key. I covered my ears while the cry continued to be heard behind the door for another 5 seconds until suddenly, nothing was heard, until everything was silent. My heart was pounding 1,000 per minute, and I was as agitated as if I had run a 100-meter dash. I wanted to flee the hotel because I was dying of fear, but the only exit I had besides the door I had just closed was through a window with a 3-meter drop. Also, I couldn't leave it abandoned. I couldn't leave the place because it was irresponsible to leave the job behind. So I forced myself to calm down. Of course, I couldn't sleep, and I didn't open the door of the room for any reason. I ignored all the calls that came to the reception phone, and I waited there until dawn. When the daylight finally entered the hotel, I went out slowly, very scared, but nothing happened, and there was nothing new. In fact, nothing had been heard again since I entered the room and locked myself in. I played music at a considerable volume while I did the cash register balance and waited for my departure time. As soon as my relief arrived, I handed everything over and ran home, where I hoped that the minutes wouldn't pass so quickly because that same night I had to go to work. And once again, I would be alone. Now I understood why the previous receptionists didn't return, not even to resign. However, I couldn't afford to be without a job, so I went to work that night and the next 3 with much fear. But nothing similar happened again. Telling my boss would be in vain because I already knew he would ignore me, so I only discussed it with my family and closest friends. Some believed me, others didn't. But I know what I experienced. I know it was not a product of my imagination. Months passed, the virus was controlled, and everyone was gradually coming out of confinement. The end of the year arrived, and for the Christmas holidays, we already had a considerable number of reservations in the hotel. It coincided that Christmas Eve fell on a Thursday, so I had to work as if it were any other day and couldn't spend it with my family. Around 9:30 at night, the hotel was empty because all the guests went out to dinner, and since the hotel restaurant was out of service, I was alone again. While I was at reception, my brother called me via video call. I answered and could see him, all my family, and his girlfriend's family gathered, who wanted to share at least virtually with me the family embrace and make me part of the moment. After all the congratulations and displays of affection, my brother said the following: "Hey, tell my mother-in-law about your paranormal experience, that one where you heard a girl's scream. She really likes that kind of unexplained phenomena." I proceeded to flip the view of my camera to narrate what had happened to me that night of terror, while showing the hotel to my brother's mother-in-law and everyone watching on the phone. I wanted to explain graphically where the noise came from, taking advantage of the fact that at that hour, all the lights were still on. However, while I was narrating while pointing out what had happened, my brother's mother-in-law interrupted me and said something I didn't expect. "Hey, didn't you say you were alone? Because I see a girl on the 3rd floor." I froze. I looked at the screen of my cell phone and could distinguish in the distance a girl with her back turned, but when I looked to see her directly with my eyes at the same place, there was no one. It was as if you could only see her through the screen. "No, ma'am, there's no one here," I told them seriously. Everyone could see the young woman on the video call, just like I could on my phone screen, but when I looked, there was still no one. I gathered courage from wherever I could, ran up the stairs to where that girl was, but she was slowly moving away as I was going up. I kept pointing towards where she was, while in the background I heard everyone telling me through the phone not to go up, but I simply ignored them. By the time I reached the floor where I had seen her, there was no one. And the most significant thing of all is that I wasn't the only one who saw her. All those who were present during the video call realized that that woman simply disappeared. Everyone was shocked, and if anyone doubted what I had come to tell about what was happening there, at that moment they realized that I wasn't lying, that I had never lied to them. I continued working at the hotel for several more months, during which similar things kept happening but not of such magnitude. On one occasion, my brother came to visit me, and it happened that that day there were no occupied rooms. We were alone, and at the end of the corridor the light turned on and the door of one of the rooms opened. He swore it had been a guest, but when I showed him the reservation book, which was empty, he was surprised. I then invited him to go to the room to see that there was no one, and he agreed. But in the end, he got a bit scared and stayed outside the room while I went in and showed him that there was no one there. At the end of his visit, he asked me how it was possible that I could work under such strange conditions. I just told him that after what happened that night when the scream was heard, it was no longer so complicated to deal with the others. But to be honest, I always asked God that something like that wouldn't happen again. In mid-2021, I received a very promising job offer where I would earn more money than at the hotel, and in addition, would be working in the field I had studied. It was then that I resigned from the hotel and left on the best of terms. I left grateful for working there, but with little desire to do it again. That's how I left my position as the night shift receptionist. A year later, I spoke with Javier, my ex-boss, my brother's friend. I asked him to rent me the hotel terrace because I wanted to ask the girl I was dating at the time to be my girlfriend there. He didn't want to charge me and lent me the space for that occasion without any complications. After the proposal, I set the mood with music using my Alexa speaker, which I had placed in the center of the terrace bar. Unexpectedly, from one moment to another, while we were sitting drinking wine, the speaker fell off the bar as if someone had pushed it from there. My girlfriend and I were stunned, incredulous at what had just happened, at what we had just seen. It wasn't possible for the speaker to fall just like that. It was far from the edge and the bar was very wide. There was no explanation for it. I remember very well that the only thing I did was smile and say to her, "See, I told you strange things happen here."